I mean, there's just this brilliant level of comedy involved in car parking on a Sunday morning now, where you've got this fantastic team of guys and ladies that are out in the car park with these massive foam hands pointing.
Foam hands, I love that.
Yeah, we've got like a crossing lollipop thing that
Yeah.
I made for us to enable safe pedestrian crossings because we had to.
Well, hello and welcome to the Church Office podcast. My name is Gavin Smith, and it's a joy to welcome you today to this Admin and Ops podcast. We love talking about the work of ministry behind the scenes, and I've got a special guest on today, Owen Gilham from Danbury Mission. Welcome, my friend. How are you doing?
All good, thank you, Gavin.
It's good to have you on the podcast. And before we jump into our conversation, I just want to do a big shout out to our sponsors, Church Suite, who have kindly offered to sponsor the podcast to get behind this ministry and this work. And we're really grateful for them. And if you've not come across Church Suite before, then this is a brilliant piece of software that will make your life as a church manager so much easier. Let me tell you, it is a joy to use. It will help organize things. It will help coordinate things. It's great with communication. There are multiple modules that you can use. This isn't just a church database. This is far, far more than that. It is a discipleship tool. It is a tool for the office. It is a tool for group leaders and pastors to care for people. It brings great process, and so we highly recommend it, and we're grateful for our partnership with the guys at Church Suite. So please check it out at churchsuite.com. All right, Owen, on to today's podcast, mate. It's great to chat to you. Owen and I met when I came and did a bit of a kind of a back office review. I guess that was probably almost a year ago now, is it?
Yeah, probably approaching that, I would have thought. Yeah.
It's probably been something like that. And Simon Medcroft and I spent a bit of time together at the FIC conference and connected. And I came over and spent a couple of days with you guys at the church. It's a fantastic church, isn't it? Owen, fill us in. Tell us a little bit about the church.
So we're based in Danbury, which is on the outskirts of Chelmsford in Essex. Chelmsford's a relatively new city, so a growing kind of population. But as I say, we're on the edges of the city, in a little village, which is kind of weird having a big modern church in a little village in the middle of the countryside. But the church is big, is growing. We've just moved to 2 Sunday morning services in order to accommodate people, just because things were getting a bit crowded on a Sunday morning service. So 2 services has enabled us to kind of divide up the church family so that everyone can sit down comfortably. And yeah, we've been around for a long time. I think the church was founded in 1906.
Oh, class.
But obviously a lot has happened since then. So yeah.
Yeah, you guys have got a fantastic facility, and it is right. It is the first thing that sort of strikes you about Danbury Mission is that you've got almost a city-sized church, over 800 people in what is a relatively small village, isn't it? But you guys have got a great heart to share the gospel, not just locally, but right across Essex. And you guys have set up a mission organization, if you like, of Mission Essex to tell people about Jesus. Fill us in a little bit about that.
So yeah, Mission Essex was formed in, I think it was 2021, September 21. Just because we were finding more and more that smaller churches that were struggling in one way or another throughout Essex were coming to us for advice and guidance on a whole range of things, whether that was kind of help with preaching and pastoral issues and mentoring, or whether it was more operational things and administrative issues that they were facing. They were coming to us for that advice. And it felt like, given that the amount of inquiries we were given, it felt timely to try and maybe formalize our response to those requests for help.
Yeah, it's a great thing. Simon Medcroft is leading that, and you've adopted some churches, you've planted churches, the whole concept of revitalization, which is becoming more and more a thing in the UK, where churches are getting to lower numbers and are asking for help. And there are bigger churches that are stepping in, and I know we've been involved in a couple of cases. And so you guys have got a great heart. So if you're listening to the podcast, please check out their websites. Please find out a little bit more about them. It's a really interesting model, and I love their passion to reach Essex with the gospel. It's almost like that is your mission field, isn't it? You've identified that as your mission field. You're working
Absolutely.
with other churches and doing all that you can to spread the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but I think one of the things that we found in relation to Mission Essex is that we're in a really good position in terms of population growth, but Essex is not well. Churches in Essex are not well represented.
Mm.
There are quite a few smaller churches, but on the whole, the growing population in Essex isn't equally served by a growing population of churches. So, if we can help in respect of church growth, then that's definitely something that we want to do.
Yeah, it's great. And so you've got a big team on site, haven't you? And we know, as you know, and a number of our listeners know that operations and administration is absolutely essential. And I think it's essential whether you've got a church of 800 or you've got a church of 20. The kind of gifts that you have and I have and others in churches serving, these are essential, aren't they? And you came into your role as the operations manager 2019, I think you said.
Yeah, that's right. September 2019, I started. So just got in before COVID kicked off.
Little introduction and then straight into something. Tell us
Yeah.
what did you do before coming into church? Like, how did you end up in this kind of role?
My background's predominantly in education, the education sector. Prior to that, I spent a bit of time working in theatre, bizarrely.
Yeah,
But after that, moved into education probably in around 2001, I think.
yeah,
Kicked off working in support services in education, and worked in middle management and senior management within the college and higher education sectors, managing everything from student support, safeguarding, student finance, accommodation,
yeah,
um, uh, development of learning resources online, a bit of kind of website development and that kind of thing, sort of online work, learning environments.
yeah.
Through to I did some teaching latterly in my time in education as well. So yeah, a lot of a
Yeah.
lot of well, probably anyone that works in education will recognise the story, but you tend not to do one thing if you work in education. You tend to
Yeah.
do an awful lot of everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And it's, have you found that those skills and those things that you were refining in education have come into the church workplace now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess there's a lot that we do within churches that is kind of, I mean, the church is a teaching environment essentially, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there is an awful lot of crossover. In terms of my experience, I've been able to put an awful lot of my experience of safeguarding, for example, through to my experience in church, but there are an awful lot of kind of compliance issues around policy development and just making sure that we operate as an organisation in an ordered and professional way, I
Yeah.
guess, in order that people are able to uh, experience the church in a safe and in the most effective way that we can offer it to them. If
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah,
if that
yeah,
makes sense.
absolutely right. Yeah. And I think it's true, isn't it, for operations managers or church managers, however, there's lots of different job titles around this. You,
Mhm.
you do wear lots of hats and you do have to have quite a broad range of experience. One minute you're working on on policy, like safeguarding policy,
Yeah.
health and safety. You're working on that. You're doing building maintenance. You're then jumping into the finances and budgets, and then you're working with people and teams, and you're always, so there are just so many hats and multiple things. And I found from my experience that, yeah, it was almost like God had placed me into different roles prior to coming to the church that I look back on and go, oh yeah, that was really helpful. Working through that and doing that has enabled me to learn skills that
Yeah.
I never would have, thought would be needed in the church, but they really are essential.
Yeah,
Um,
I really recognise what you're saying there, and I feel similarly to how you've just expressed that. Um, and I think the thing with churches is that I've talked about, I used the word professionalism earlier, and that doesn't a lot of the stuff, policy, procedure, professionalism, compliance, they just don't, that doesn't feel like particularly churchy language.
yeah,
Um, but the reality is that we're organisations that want to do things right.
yeah,
Um, we want to do things in a lawful, proper, respectful, and compliant way. Um, and those are, policy, procedure, professionalism. That's the toolkit that underpins doing
yeah,
things rightly.
yeah.
Um, so that's the way. That's the sort of in a nutshell how I view what I do, what you do, and what we bring to the church context.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense, isn't there, that as we do our roles, we get to somehow reflect something of God's character in our role. And I think I see that in terms of how we bring order to certain situations, how we bring an excellence about things. I think we go right back to Genesis, and there's a call to govern and to oversee and to run. And I think a lot of our work is related into that, and so we get to reflect something of God in that. And there is a I'd say there is a drive across churches, certainly larger churches, to have that excellence, to have people in these roles. But some of the challenges are coming, and maybe we can open up a little bit about your experience with Mission Essex, that the churches where they're under 50 and there are a small minority of people who are doing an awful lot of work in the church. They find this whole area of compliance and health and safety, safeguarding, these are real challenges, aren't they, for smaller churches? What's been your experience on that as you've helped other churches in Mission Essex?
Yeah, I mean, I guess firstly, it's a challenge in bigger churches as well because we
Mhm.
get, like I say, these things don't feel terribly church centric, and I guess you're looking at things that are in their essence. You talk about compliance. You're talking about complying with rules and legislation that is of the world around us, and there's sometimes a tendency to push against that
Yeah,
when we maybe feel like that challenges what we believe. But in smaller churches as well, it's just, I guess there's less of a knowledge base very often.
yeah,
There's a lot of responsibility put on a smaller group of people, which is really challenging, particularly where those people are probably not employed by the church. So they're kind of balancing those responsibilities in the church against what they're doing on a day-to-day basis to make ends meet. Um, and in terms of, I guess in terms of making those things, embedding the kind of operational infrastructures that we're talking about, that then becomes really difficult when you've got a limited number of volunteers
yeah,
um, who probably have some experience of those things, but maybe it becomes more difficult, certainly, to explain to those people, find time to explain to the people that are actually doing the work on a weekly basis, why we need to do something in a specific and compliant way. So yeah, it's fraught with challenges, really. I mean,
it
there are
is.
some positives there as well. If you're working within a smaller church, to some extent, it's far easier to roll out training, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, there are definitely some positives. But yeah, it's we our role in Mission Essex, or one of our roles in Mission Essex, is to equip churches um, with infrastructures or springboards that they can then use to develop their own infrastructures, as well as forming a bit of a hub, I guess, for people to refer back to for advice and guidance as they move forward. Inevitably, there will always be questions around this stuff because it's complicated by its nature. So
yeah.
we're a friendly group of people at the end of the telephone line that guys at the smaller churches can refer back to and ask questions on.
Yeah. And that's great, isn't it? To have that support structure that you guys have got in Mission Essex. And I know some churches, if they're involved in a denomination of some kind, then they will get that similar kind of support. But if you are listening to the podcast and you are thinking, oh my goodness, I am on my own, there isn't people that I can turn to get advice, then please feel free to get in contact with the church office. We'd love to be able to point you in the right direction. I'm sure Owen will happily share resources and whatever we can do to support it, because we see this ministry as enabling the gospel to go forward. And what we don't want is our pastors and our leaders, church leaders, to be bogged down with this kind of administrative stuff. Now, we need them involved and we want them on board with what we're doing in terms of developing policy and implementing it. But at the same time, we don't want it to become a huge distraction to the gospel. And so we're always trying to work those tensions out. And sometimes we get that right, sometimes we don't get that right. And if you're trying to work that out and you're feeling quite on your own, then please do get in contact with us. We'd love to do that. Owen, for when you talk about infrastructures and stuff like that, what are you kind of talking about when you're talking about someone who's listening to this podcast going, oh, what does that mean? And what kind of infrastructure would you put into a church? Open that up for us a little bit.
So with our church specifically, I mean, we have a large-ish staff team. So from the point that I landed in 2019, one of the focuses I had was reviewing existing policy and procedure and developing new policies and procedures, for example, around how we manage HR, human resources, and extending that to the wider church workforce, but making it relevant to the larger church workforce as well, so that as one example, so that every member of staff would know what was expected of them personally, but also what was expected of them as a member of staff within the church.
Yeah.
That then translates across to your voluntary workforce by making sure that actually people aren't making broad assumptions around what it is that we're asking them to do as a youth leader. They have a kind of specific role overview that can guide them, but also can refer back to a set of expectations that we have in terms of behaviour, in terms of conduct.
Yeah.
And that's not, I'm not
that's good.
Stick to beat people with there. It's a tool for people to help them develop their understanding and actually help them make decisions about whether the voluntary work that they're entering into, the ministry that they're working or intending to work within, is the correct ministry for them.
Yeah.
With other smaller churches, I think one of our big focuses has been safeguarding. What we've found is that that's something that smaller churches really struggle with, particularly the safer recruitment elements of safeguarding responsibilities, notably DBS check-in, because it's administrative drudgery, and it has to be done. It has to be done in a particular way, and the churches that we're working with just don't have the resources administratively to make that happen. So we've supported to put in place processes using Church Suite, funnily enough. So we've used flows within Church Suite. We've worked with the way that the smaller churches within Mission Essex are using Church Suite, and we've built flows for them to help them manage and track the DBS check-in process. So that's one of the infrastructures that we're talking about. But other things like our facilities manager, Trevor, has been very involved in supporting churches around buildings related issues, compliance issues, making sure that, for example, they've got up-to-date fire risk assessments, evacuation processes in place, that they make sense to everyone. Everyone's effectively trained and so on. So the infrastructure, I guess the infrastructure with us, it has been very much focused on making sure that as a staff team we're doing things correctly, and that can then bleed out to the broader workforce and the broader church environment. With the smaller churches, it's been more about addressing specific issues that they're facing and struggling with, to try and make sure that they're able to be compliant, but also doing that in such a way that it's not just a box ticking exercise, that it's actually meaningful and useful for them.
Yeah. And that's essentially right, isn't it? You know, we often say to smaller churches, like, take a step back and let's look at the kind of ministry that you are doing or you want to be doing. And then let's go back and say, right, what do we need to have in place? And I think people just, you know, they hear something, another church is doing this, another church had to, I don't know, get some sort of system in place for this. Right, what are we going to do? And there's a little bit of panic, there's a little bit of, and you're like, whoa, let's slow down a little bit and let's just take stock about it, take a step back and say, right, what do we need? And I think the stuff that you're talking about, role descriptions and stuff like that, these small little things are so helpful in smaller churches to understand the scope and the responsibility that we're giving to somebody and asking them to do. And then we've got a checkpoint to be able to go back and review it and see how they're doing and what kind of support they need, you know, more support they might need.
I mean, one of the things that I'm going to be working on in the next little while actually is, thinking back to when I worked in education, something that we developed was a student health check. So when we noticed that there was a lot of attrition around adult students within education, so people would start courses and essentially drop out of those courses within the first few months because they didn't have in place what they needed to succeed. So we developed what we call a student health check, which looked at basically the person's ability to meet the rigors of being in education. What we're now looking at doing within Mission Essex is I'm putting together a church health check effectively, where we can test, in inverted commas, it's not actually a test, but test what the church already has in place, how robust that is, identify gaps and difficulties that they might face around what they already have, but also identify what they don't have, and then formulate an action plan. At the moment, it feels like we're very reactive within Mission Essex. What we want to be is more strategic, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds great, and I think churches, you know, are going to be blessed, and it's going to be so helpful. And you're right. It's conversations around structure and policy that's so important. That it isn't just I need this policy, tick box done. Nobody in the congregation knows about it. Nobody who's relating to that policy understand it. We've not done any training on it. So understanding our context, being able to have the right things in place that are appropriate. And we chat to a lot of churches who don't have any kids, so they don't think they need a safeguarding policy. And it's the first thing we, you know, but it's like, actually, we need to take a broader picture of this. So we need to create a safe environment for everyone, and not just to focus on kids. And you've got older members typically in these smaller churches who also need to be safeguarded. So it's start trying to challenge those mindsets and those thinkings. And governance just moves on, and it gets harder, doesn't it, as well? That's the reality.
You're so right with what you've said there as well. That there's yes, there's the tick in the boxes side of things, where you need, you know, the Charity Commission says if you're a church and you're a charity, you have to have safeguarding policy in place. Box ticked, you've got that in place. But if no one knows how to use the procedure that sits around that policy, you know, you're in no better position than you were without having the policy, actually. So we've been at pains to make sure that that what we're doing with those churches is meaningful. If we develop a policy, that policy has to be embedded properly and it has to work for the church. and be effective in looking after people. And in terms of safeguarding, you're absolutely right. Again, you're not just looking at kids there, you're looking at the broader church. And I mean, we notice that the majority of our safeguarding referrals, I'm designated lead for safeguarding, the majority of the issues that are escalated to me aren't actually to do with children, and don't actually come from Sundays.
Yeah.
They come from all of the broader ministry work that the church is doing, and very often, actually, they don't end up even being safeguarding issues. They end up being longer term, complex welfare needs,
Yeah.
that relate to the ability of often older people who are no longer able to look after themselves,
Yeah.
or aren't having their needs met in one way or another.
Yeah.
So it's people
Yeah.
hear safeguarding and think kids, and it's my point was, it's not, you're absolutely right, it's not always just children.
Yeah, absolutely right. And if you're interested in this kind of, we did a podcast with Christian Safeguarding Services, looking at this kind of vulnerable adults and looking at this kind of safer environment. So please go back and check out with Paul and Sue Harrison. We chatted to them about their perspective on this, and it is useful. And because the podcast is very topical, there's lots of things that you can go back through if you're interested in, you know, talking about health and safety. You want to learn a little bit more and hear a conversation around, you know, implementing a new tool like Church Suite that we've been talking about, that provides a lot of structure already for you to be able to kind of build on. Then please check out those podcasts and stuff. Owen, tell us a little bit about life for you in a busy church. You talked about going to 2 Sundays with growth. I mean, that is like duplicating the work on, you know, on a Sunday. And I know you've taken a huge role in kind of implementing what that looks like. For churches who are listening, that is a reality for them in the next few months. Fill us in on what you've learned from that kind of changeover of going from one service to two.
I've learned there's a lot of hard work for everyone. Yeah, so just talking numbers to begin with, I think you mentioned about 800 people, so that would be across all Mission Essex churches.
Yeah.
Here on a Sunday, we had we were probably approaching 430 people attending a Sunday morning service each week.
Yeah.
Capacity of our auditorium is 460. And that would, you know, 430 was uncomfortable, 460 would have been really, you know, we were finding that people were saying, even at the point, you know, coming up to our decision to move to 2 services, people were saying to us, actually, I don't want to come to church because I'm not comfortable. I'm distracted by the fact that it's so crowded. I don't feel like I'm able to speak to all of the people that I want to speak to.
Yeah.
So it was impacting, and there were a number of options that we explored as stage one to address that. And we looked at, for example, the possibility of another church plant. We've already got a church plant in central Chelmsford. We were looking at possibly planting towards Malden and Heybridge, which is probably the equal distance in the opposite direction from us.
Yeah.
But that's a very expensive thing to do. And in terms of what we would gain from that, I think that would have enabled probably about 60 people to move to a church plant, which wouldn't have made things all that much more comfortable. And with the way the church grows, actually, it wouldn't have given us all that much time before we'd reached the same sort of capacity levels again.
Yeah.
We also looked at the possibility of redeveloping part of the building. Again, hugely expensive, incredibly disruptive to the work that we're already doing.
Yeah.
So the first part was doing due diligence, basically, and exploring those options, and also allowing our church family to have some input into that decision-making process, to express their views, their concerns, their worries. So we used a tool. So for everything, all of our online forms, all of our surveys that we do, that kind of thing, it's all done through a fantastic online form builder called Paperform. who I would give a big shout out to. They offer a massive charity discount, so we're able to enjoy their services for $1 a month.
$1 a month.
$1 a month.
Yeah.
For a really, really sophisticated online form builder. So yeah, put together a survey online, got all of that feedback around people's opinions, thoughts, feelings, discussed that. There was a lot of kind of consultation through church meetings with the church family, but essentially that enabled the elders of the church to get to a point where they could see realistically the only way to move forward was to divide the congregation on Sunday morning in two and offer two church services. Through that consultation process, we determined that there was a preference for the times that we ran those services, 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. We then started the kind of formal logistical, I suppose, planning process around that. You know, how do we manage car parking?
Yeah.
How do we deal with the fact that the band and the AV team were already having to get, with a 10 o'clock service, they were having to get to the church for 8:30. We're now bringing that forward. Potentially they would be getting to the church for 7:30 in the morning. And how realistic is that? So there were things that had to be kind of worked through with those kind of logistical demands on a Sunday morning, and also working out the changeover in between the two church services, working out how much time we needed to reset rooms, to reset the kitchen, to serve tea and coffee and get cleared up again. Would we need to reset chairs, etc., etc. So lots of kind of practical things to think about.
Huge logistics there, isn't it?
Yeah. So the logistics was one side of it. The other side of that coin was the impact on people's experience as a result of those logistics. We've got some great ministry leads here, and we were able to meet with the ministry leads and say, look, these are the logistical things that we need to consider. We'd like you to work out how to best approach these issues, these considerations. And one of the things we said was actually, you know, we don't want this to be a kind of arduous process where it feels like we're chasing the members of the church family around with a cosh on a Sunday morning, trying to chivvy them up out of the auditorium so that we can reset it and that kind of thing. And we've had some great responses. So the car parking lead there's just this brilliant level of comedy involved in car parking on a Sunday morning now, where you've got this fantastic team of guys and ladies that are out in the car park with these massive foam hands pointing where people should go in the car park.
Foam hands, I love that.
Yeah, we've got like a crossing lollipop thing that I made for us to enable safe pedestrian crossings, because we had to change the routes that people coming into
flow and everything.
So that, you know, the ability of ministry leads to just kind of bring fun to this process was really important, and for them to feel supported and included in doing that was really important. I think it was vital that we didn't just dictate and say, this is how it's going to be, this is how we're going to do it. To actually be able to say to our ministry leads, you're a big part of this picture and we need your support in doing this, and we want you to take some ownership of it, was really important and really helpful.
That's great. That I love the fact you're bringing life and fun into that, you know, and just thinking about that in the car park. Having driven in your car park, great. Just seeing people with giant foam hands is great. And this bit here you touch on is so much of the job, isn't it? It's people focused. How do we care for people when they come on a Sunday? How can we, you know, ensure that they get the best experience? We want them to hear God's word. We don't want them to be distracted by all these things that are going on. And yet at the same time, you are building teams, working with leaders, hearing their thoughts, working out a plan together. This is all the people part of the role, which sometimes gets a bit forgotten about when we talk about governance and compliance and structures. Actually, this is a real people thing. So you can't sit behind your desk and do this. You
Yeah.
got to be out there chatting to people.
Yeah, and look, I mean, let's be under no illusions. Compliance and policy and procedure doesn't set anyone's heart on fire. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I quite like it, but you know, most people glaze over when you start talking about this stuff. And I was quite surprised when you said, "Owen, can you talk to me on a podcast for an hour about compliance?" I was like,
You must be
uh,
joking.
but yeah, um, but yeah, if you just impose things, I mean, there are some things that yes, you have to just run with because we have to do certain things in a particular way. That is the nature of compliance. But you still have to bring people with you on that.
Yeah.
You can't just, well, you can just dictate, but if you do that, you end up with potentially quite a lot of alienated people that don't really understand why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something I learned from education. The colleges that I worked in, or most of them anyway, were great at involving staff in the strategic development and the planning of what the college was doing and how it was doing it. And I think that carries over to any organisation actually. If you can take the people that you're working with you and involve them in processes and not just dictate, then
Yes.
that's a really powerful thing to do.
Yeah, great. Yeah, really good, Owen. And if you're listening to this as a pastor or senior pastor even, to the podcast, please engage your, administrative team, whether it's voluntary or whether it's someone in a paid role, in this whole area of compliance. Don't just disregard it as, oh, it's that, annoying thing that we have to keep on coming back to. But actually, this is an important part of gospel ministry. And we as administrators and operations people can see the link between policy and the gospel. And so please give people time and room who are working in these areas. They want to serve the church. They want there to be excellence. They want to get behind your ministry and the gospel. These aren't conflicting. These are there to work together to support. And I think often I find pastors who don't give any time to thinking about this, any room in meetings to chat these things through. So if you are listening to that, then please let me push back a little bit and challenge you to engage in these topics and make the life of those in operations easier. And I'm not saying don't challenge it and don't push back when you're thinking, when I get excited about doing a fire drill on a Sunday morning, not everyone is getting excited about that prospect. But again, these are things that we need to be doing to care for our churches and care for our kids to ensure that if in a situation where there is a fire, we can get everyone out safely. And these are all the little tensions that go on in the background, aren't they, with leaderships and trustees but we want there to be this sense of order and excellence in everything that we do. Owen, any other top tips before we call it a day on the podcast? Anything that you would share that you think, oh, this would be a bit of wisdom for someone listening?
Um, I guess things that I've learned over the last little while, and I think this kind of comes from our experience of COVID, is that there's a real, things can often seem tiresome and difficult and like unnecessary hard work, but actually use the experience and see the opportunities in that. We did an awful lot of risk assessing during the pandemic, which I came into the job having a real love for risk assessments. I'm quite unusual in that way.
Yeah.
And COVID killed that love of risk assessments.
Yeah.
But actually that gave us an opportunity to address what we were doing and the way that we were doing things and built a platform from which we can develop things in the future.
Yeah.
So don't be disheartened by what sometimes seems like a kind of antagonizingly painful set of processes that are often imposed by people, structures, organizations that don't have a great understanding of the church. Use that as an opportunity to look at what you're doing and build a platform for the future.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it's often I've met two churches who church managers have worked diligent in these areas, particularly around the area of HR and volunteer roles. And they've had situations where things have gone wrong, and the fact that they had done the hard work years ago in bringing right policy and procedure and training, they were able to show, and that stuff that they had in place was able to help them to navigate through what were some challenging situations. And meeting pastors in those churches going, I am so grateful for that work that was done. I didn't really even know how important it was, but it made a huge difference in the scenario that we find ourselves in now. And so if you are, as Owen has said, you are involved in this policy and procedure, you're involved in governance and compliance, this serves the church massively, and be encouraged to know that what you're doing is great. And yeah, we want to do it in humble hearts and we want to serve. But yeah, this is stuff that really does make a difference in church life when stuff does go wrong, and you realize it at that point, don't you?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Jamie. Actually, I think people do worry that this stuff could get in the way of the gospel and big distraction. But actually, the far greater risk is if something goes wrong, what will happen as a result of that going wrong if you don't have policies and procedures in place is a far greater risk to the gospel and the work that churches are doing. Because people attending church, parents that are bringing their kids to youth work will simply lose faith in what's being done by the church, or worse, the church will face legal ramifications of something catastrophic having happened. So it's important to focus on getting these things right.
Yeah, absolutely right. So please give us a shout, Owen or I. Please get in contact with Mission Essex. Please get in contact with the church office. There are other numerous places that you can go, stewardship and other places. These guys are doing great work, and we would recommend you take the next step. If you're thinking, right, I need to take the next step today, I've heard what I've heard and I need to make some changes, then there is support out there, and we encourage you to go and find that support. So Owen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, mate. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. We're super excited to continue to track what Mission Essex is doing, taking the gospel out to all of Essex. And I love the work that you guys and the team there at Danbury Mission are doing. And please check out the other podcasts. Please check out the church office website. If there are documents or templates or things that you are in need of, please check out the site and see if we've got something that might serve you. All right, we'll see you next time on the podcast. Goodbye.